is a special episode, so we're starting a little differently. That's why we didn't do the usual intro. Mr. Ridenour wants everything topsy-turvy for this show because that's kind of the theme of his new book, which is what this show's about. The book is called A Season of Madness, Fools, Monsters, and Marvels of the Old World Carnival. And it's available in the US on May 6th and a bit later internationally. But if you're listening before then, it's also available immediately via pre-order. Okay, I think that's it. So now on to the show. Episode 140, The Unknown Carnival.
Step right up, see the four-legged girl
Absolutely not what the book is about, so don't step up and get it out of your head. This is that other kind of carnival, that thing celebrated in Catholic countries in February or March. And why write about that? Because of my interest in the Krampus, the traditions are surprisingly interwoven, which I'll get to shortly. But back to this. That's what many people seem to hear when I say the word carnival, when I tell them it's what the book's about. At least here in America, it's all that comes to mind. And it's sad, really. Carnival is like a party to which America's not been invited. Yes, we have Mardi Gras, but New Orleans is a world unto itself, so that doesn't translate nationally. There's something discomforting about being left out of the party, so we're wrong-footed even in attempts to talk about it. We're uncertain even how to spell or pronounce this carnival. Just to be sure people know we're not discussing tilt-a-whirls and cotton candy, we might decide the word needs a more international spelling and add an E, change some vowels, or say it kind of funny. If you're speaking, for instance, of the Italian carnival, you can say carnevale, but carnival is perfectly good for describing any of these festivities in whatever the country. It's universal and more than acceptable. And here's how we got there. Because America doesn't do the European Carnival, and since the word was just sitting there unused, we Americans decided to give it a new meaning in the 1890s. Carnival began to be applied to traveling shows modeled on the success of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, specifically the Central Area or Midway collection of rides, games, and sideshow acts, which they christened the Midway Plaisance, giving us another generic term, Midway, along with the gratuitous French plaisance for pleasure, another example of our tendency to arbitrarily internationalize things. Maybe the transient nature of those midways, set up one day and gone the next, suggested something analogous to Carnival and its fleeting season of pleasures. Like the celebration, the traveling shows arrived in town annually at roughly the same time, but with certain unpredictable variations, just as Carnival shifts slightly year to year thanks to its date being anchored to Lent and, by extension, Easter. This lack of a fixed date also makes Americans uneasy about Carnival. The arcane calculations by which Easter is set is a relic of pre-Reformation Europe, the kind of thing our patriotic forefathers would have decried as Romish popery. It's one thing to submit to the fickleness of movable feasts when it comes with chocolate eggs and peeps, but Lent is altogether different, a bridge too far for most Americans. Though Lent is ostensibly part of all Christian traditions, its role is minimal in Protestant churches, leaving its most powerful legacy in Catholicism. This idea of the Catholic's penitential starvation is un-American enough, but to then precede it with a season of rapacious indulgence does not really sit well in a country founded upon coolly rational Enlightenment ideals. But we are a broad-minded nation, so we make the effort to squeeze in those foreign words from Catholic culture. We've assimilated the term Mardi Gras, but the whole thing's too tangled up in beads and breast flashing for universal application, and its use is restricted to a single day after all. Besides, we already have the British equivalent, Shrove Tuesday, or Shrovetide for the days before Tuesday. But Shrove is just as foreign as the French, and being British disqualifies it as our go-to term, since Britain doesn't really have a carnival. It's sad, but eating pancakes on Shrove Tuesday doesn't really count.
Our itinerary.
As you will have guessed, this book will be going off the beaten path beyond festivities designated by Latin-derived names. We'll explore the Fastnacht of Germany, the Zapusta of Poland, the Czech Masopust, the Russian Maslenitsa, and the Bulgarian Sirnai Zaksinai, to name just a few. Enough about the word. What exactly does this book cover? Our itinerary will begin in Italy, looking at Rome's influence, then on to Venice, and finally Germany. You're hearing Chapter 1. Next is
Chapter 2.
Sardine versus Sausage. Here I offer a sort of overview, examining how the Church's imposition of Lent shaped Carnival, as well as some artistic responses this engendered. Along the way, you'll learn about butter letters and the burial of the sardine.
Chapter 3.
Ancient Roots. Here we look at Carnival's possible origins in the traditions of ancient Rome, both pre-Christian and post-Constantine, most plausibly in the New Year's celebration of the January calends. This holiday, distinguished by raucous behavior, grotesque costumes, and mockery of those in power, was eventually absorbed into the medieval Feast of Fools, which contributed many elements to Carnival.
Chapter 4.
Rome. We'll stay in the Eternal City, but move into the High Middle Ages, when the Latin term carne levare is first attached to public games and spectacles. Animal sacrifices in the form of bullfights and pigs tumbled down hillsides, and even more cruel and compulsory foot races, humiliating those on society's fringes. Dark stuff, which doesn't really fit how we think of Carnival today. But almost as old and slightly less brutal is the Roman tradition of racing wild horses through the city streets. It survived into the late 1800s.
Chapter 5.
Carnival in Venice, in which we encounter equally barbaric customs and blood sports worlds away from those iconic images of the city's romantic and aristocratic carnival. Moving into the early modern period, we'll see the birth of Venetian masking traditions, and along the way, somewhat more civilized entertainments, acrobatic shows, regattas, religious processions, all unique to Venice and its history, and we'll see how the use of masks was related to the throwing of eggs filled with confetti, or things much worse or much better.
Chapter 6.
German Fools describes the introduction in the mid-14th century of the Carnival Parade, including early floats, the spectacular rolling L's, as they were called, along with the surreal costumes of Nuremberg's Schembartlauf. The appearance in medieval Germany of the iconic Carnival Fool is discussed, along with the figure's associated traditions, evolution, and the contemporary practices of German fools' guilds. You'll learn about the humiliating fools' books and the things they do with the perfumed calf's tail in the city of Rottweil. After these first, roughly chronological chapters have laid a historical groundwork, the subsequent chapters are thematic.
Chapter 7.
Good luck visits, in which we look at house visiting customs in Germany and Eastern Europe. Includes the Czech killing of the mare ritual, and the Polish folk play The Execution of Death.
Chapter 8.
Fertility rites, in which we explore the plow and log pulling rites of Germany, Austria, Italy, Slovenia, Croatia, Poland, and Ukraine. Mock weddings are discussed, including derisive rituals binding together unmarried young people and logs. And my personal favorite, the insanely chaotic Egetman Festival of Tramin in South Tyrol. Another theme is monsters. Interspersed throughout the book's second half are chapters devoted to carnival figures of a monstrous, bestial, or otherwise extraordinary nature.
Chapter 9.
The Current and the Plow. Now nearly exclusively showcased in celebrations in the town of Plough, Slovenia, the Current was once part of a house-visiting tradition involving a magic plow that imparted good luck and fertility. He's recognizable by his voluminous sheepskin tunic, beribboned headpiece, and mask with dangling tongue.
Chapter 10.
The Busho, which introduces a Hungarian figure also formerly involved in house visits, but now restricted to public parades in the town of Mohacs on the Danube. He wears a massive sheepskin coat, horned hood, and comically fierce wooden mask, and is armed with a ratchet noisemaker and whip-like bull pizzle, said to convey fertility naturally. Tradition holds that the costume and noisemakers were once used to drive Turkish invaders from Mohacs, and that masks were once painted with blood from slaughterhouses.
Chapter 11.
The Kukeri. The Bulgarian kukar, plural kukeri, is perhaps the strangest carnival figure of all, given its bewildering variety of regionally different forms. Performers representing kukeri might wear towering headdresses, costumes, and cloth masks clustered with fringes, ribbons, beads, and mirrors, or appear ensconced in rustic conglomerations of animal hides, horns, skulls, tails, and feathers, sometimes mounted in vertical configurations like totem poles. Or they might be nearly featureless walking mound-like figures buried in extravagantly long sheep fur. All these variants may be seen gathering in the Bulgarian town of Pernik for the Surva festival. In western Bulgaria, Surva, beginning in January, blends the festivities of Carnival with New Year's customs and celebrates with house visits styled as mock weddings, while in the east of Bulgaria, on Shrove Tuesday, Kukeri perform a folk play, the plow ritual, bestowing luck and fertility on the community.
Chapter 12.
Carnival Bears. The bear's awakening from winter's hibernation associates him with that seasonal rebirth celebrated by Carnival. In the French and Spanish Pyrenees, a costumed bear becomes the hero of folk plays loosely enacted by the communities in the Vallespir region. We also learn a bit about magical Romani bear medicine and of the particularly anarchic carnival celebrations in Basque Country, in which bears play a supporting role.
Chapter 13.
Sardinia describes the unique carnival performances of the Italian islands Nuores region, where performers more often than not cloak themselves in black and darken any exposed flesh with burnt cork, enacting mysterious and somber scenes often involving a control figure herding, fighting, or killing performers representing beasts. Most well known are the mamotons of Mamiodas, hunched down under massive loads of cowbells and wearing black costumes, along with grimacing, angular masks. Figures from roughly a dozen towns are introduced, including the Colunganos dressed in green leaves and clattering bones, others who wear goat or boar heads as hats, and the Aionod Oriadore, whose mask is made from the pelvis of a donkey, as seen on the book's cover. Chapter 14. Killing Carnival. appropriately ends our tour, providing a wide-ranging look at the mock executions and funerals of figures embodying carnival, and the relation of these customs to German and Eastern European traditions of driving out winter or carrying out death, as well as the burning of the effigy of Maslenica by the East Slavs. The drowning of the effigy of Marjanina in Poland received special attention as a genuinely pagan practice consistently documented back to the 14th century.
Skewing east.
The preponderance of Eastern European culture surveyed reflects my interest in presenting the forgotten carnival, not simply for the sake of novelty, but because I believe these countries offer the best examples of an earlier form of carnival's evolution throughout Europe, specifically house-visiting customs, which over time were supplanted and standardized into a single municipal parade. I have neglected many larger parades, some of which nonetheless have important and interesting histories. The carnivals of Cologne, Germany, Nice, France, and Binche, Belgium are all very old and significant, but, like other omissions, didn't serve the book's thematic or historical narrative. At least, that partially explains my selectivity. But there are other reasons.
No love for carnival.
To be honest, I always considered carnival a bit boring. You may too, and for perfectly understandable reasons. But I've come around and have high hopes of helping like-minded readers beyond this hurdle. Allow me to first lay out some of my own ugly prejudices. Perhaps you share some of these sentiments.
1,
I don't like plastic.
2,
I don't like fluorescent colors.
3.
I don't like crowds. There's something soulless in plastic, but all of the most famous carnivals, barring that of Venice, rely on plastic, fiberglass for the construction of floats and sometimes masks. Fiberglass is no good at representing texture or detail, so this is approximated through the heavy use of airbrushed colors. Probably should have included airbrush in my list, but I didn't claim it was exhaustive. Fluorescent colors perhaps don't dominate the palette of every large carnival, but they needn't. Even a moderate use of fluorescent colors is enough to cause a crippling distrust of carnivals across the board. As for crowds, this is universal with any carnival of note, as well as any unremarkable but large urban carnival. It necessitates arriving too early and taking too long to get your ride when it's over. In between, there's a lot of standing, at least 5 deep, usually more, and straining to see over and around heads as plastic, fluorescent, airbrushed monstrosities creep by, all while enduring a crowded numbness in your feet and considering the obstacles faced in negotiating a path to a public restroom. There is such a thing. Also, no one likes marching bands. No one. And finally, a more ideological issue. If carnival represents a seasonal spree of madness, is that best expressed in the form of these large parades with celebrants regimented into identical costumes, marching with fife and drum? It's all a bit militant and fails miserably at the topsy-turvy ideals of carnival.
A folk aesthetic.
The sort of celebrations I've been describing are not universal to carnival. This book focuses largely on smaller scale festivities in smaller towns and villages, in part because these have received less attention elsewhere, and in part because they illustrate that earlier stage in carnival's evolution, but also as a purely aesthetic choice. In these folk carnivals, costumes worn are made by hand, improvised from hides, horns, and straw. Faces are often blacked with soot or hidden under wooden masks with sheepskin hoods. Figures wearing these costumes gather in town squares and central streets, in village inns and halls, but also visit homes and isolated farmhouses, sometimes in groups no larger than a handful. Such celebrations generally exist alongside much larger ones. In these, participants from the hinterlands come together to demonstrate their local customs in regional exhibitions. In recent years, most of these have become quite large, even drawing visitors from overseas. But the style of celebration and of the costumes worn has retained its original look, as the cultures hosting these gatherings tend to be more bound by tradition and heritage.
Pagan horrors.
I'll happily confess that my interest in such things has grown side by side with an interest in a genre which only recently received a name: folk horror. This probably accounts for my predisposition to focus on certain darker aspects of Carnival and its history. I notice this is quantitatively evidenced in the text, discovering a telling frequency of certain words: blood or bloody appearing 25 times, pagan 24, and the word devil showing up 43 times. In particular, the chapters examining the roots of Carnival in Rome and Venice contain genuinely horrific elements, as mentioned above. These are not, however, sacrifices offered to pagan gods as imagined in folk horror tales. The paganism presented in this book is comprised of a body of rural superstitions and beliefs that largely coexisted with Christian practice, undifferentiated in the common person's world, well, perhaps condemned by more exacting Catholic or Orthodox clerics. The uncovering of pre-Christian roots and carnival traditions, which might be expected of this book, is very difficult to prove, no matter how often connections to Dionysus might be suggested. In the final chapter, on Killing Carnival, however, I explore some Slavic customs which plausibly could be said to derive from pre-Christian traditions.
Krampus Revisited.
My previous book, The Krampus and the Old Dark Christmas, was inspired in part by this enthusiasm for folk horror, but also by my interest in German culture, which accounts for any disproportionate treatment of German customs in this book. When I first encountered Krampus customs, I was not aware to what extent they borrowed from older carnival tradition, the bells worn being a prime example, nor to what extent the predecessor of the Krampus, the folkloric Persch, itself would be considered a carnival figure, thanks to its association with Epiphany on January 6. Many aspects of both Krampus and Persch customs are common within Carnival throughout Europe, as far away as Bulgaria and Greece, as we'll see. In this volume, you'll notice a persistent emphasis on the interplay between Carnival traditions and those of the Christmas season. Epiphany is central to this, as it's regarded both as the end of one season and the beginning of the other. At times, it may seem I'm describing Christmas as when Eastern European Carnival carols are mentioned, or in reference to snow still being on the ground during many of the festivities discussed.
A strange and fearsome world.
You probably didn't expect Christmas in your carnival, nor snow and bloody sacrifices. The book you're holding will push aside all that festive fiberglass to show you an unknown carnival, where inflated pig bladders are commonly carried by clowns, and clubs covered in hedgehog spines are carried by monsters. The blood of costume bearers is drunk as wine. Plows are dragged over cobblestone streets, and sawdust scattered as seed, where masks are painted in blood, and jangling bones worn as costumes, where Basque men in their underwear take sledgehammers to old cars, and Sardinians wail over plastic baby dolls while making lewd jokes or push bedpans filled with burning hair toward the crotches of onlookers to induce fertility. Carnival can be very strange.